The year was 1993. Ethan worked as a night custodian at the abandoned St. Jude's Hospital Annex, a sprawling, derelict brick building scheduled for demolition. His job was simple: keep the place clean enough to pass inspection until the wrecking balls arrived. The pay was good, and the solitude was appealing, except for the uncanny silence of the operating rooms and the endless dark corridors. One slow Tuesday night, while sweeping the basement level, a labyrinth of defunct pipes and fuse boxes, he discovered a small, heavy black box tucked beneath a workbench. It looked like a military surplus shortwave radio receiver, complete with heavy knobs and a frayed antenna. Curiosity winning over caution, Ethan carried it up to the main lobby, found a functional outlet, and plugged it in. The box immediately came to life with a crackle of static and the green glow of its analog display. He twisted the tuning dial, cycling through the usual noise: amateur radio chatter, bursts of distorted music, and deep-sea weather reports. Then he hit a frequency that froze his hand on the knob. The static vanished, replaced by a sound so clinical and cold it sent a shiver down his spine. The voice of a woman, speaking in a monotone German accent, reciting long, random strings of numbers. It was a number station, a relic of the Cold War, usually used for sending coded messages to spies. Wir, drei, acht, null, zwei, fünf. Ethan was fascinated. He had heard about these but never encountered one in the wild. He recorded the frequency and let the machine run, listening to the unsettling rhythm of the numbers until the broadcast abruptly stopped, replaced by a smooth, high-pitched electronic tone, the carrier signal. The next night, he was back, sitting in the lobby with the radio. At the stroke of 2 a.m., the German woman returned. Ethan diligently wrote down the sequence in a notebook. 6, 9, 1, 2, 7. He noticed something strange. The background sound was no longer just the clean electronic buzz of the carrier signal. Beneath the numbers, there was a faint, intermittent thump, scrape that sounded exactly like a mop handle dragging across a linoleum floor. Ethan glanced around the vast, silent lobby. He was the only cleaner. He listened closer. The woman continued her countdown, but now the background noise was undeniable. The squeak of old rubber gloves, the metallic clatter of keys on a ring, and the distinct, chilling hiss of an industrial floor buffer. It sounded exactly like a recording of Ethan working his shift. He panicked and quickly turned the dial, scrambling the frequency. The ghostly audio dissolved into white noise. The third night, Ethan was ready to throw the radio away, but his curiosity and a terrifying need to confirm what he'd heard kept him from destroying it. He tuned in at 2 a.m. The German woman was there, but tonight her voice was strained, almost breathless. 5, 1, 9, 0, 8, wir.
The background sound was horrific. It was the sound of a struggle, muffled shouts, heavy breathing, a sudden, sickening, wet thud. It sounded like someone being attacked, right there in the hospital annex. Then the woman's voice broke the pattern, speaking one word in English, her voice tight with terror. "He's here." The signal cut out instantly. No carrier tone, no static. Dead silence. Ethan dropped his notebook. His eyes darted around the dark lobby. "He's here. Who?" He heard a noise from the far end of the hallway, the slow, grating sound of the heavy gurney wheel squeaking on the tile. It was coming closer. Ethan scrambled backward, grabbing the radio box. He had to get out. He knew with absolute certainty that the broadcast wasn't a recording of the past. It was a live mirror of his immediate surroundings to some unseen recipient. He ran for the main exit.
Ethan burst through the front doors and didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his car. He tossed the shortwave radio onto the passenger seat, fumbled with the keys, and sped away from the dark, echoing hospital annex. He drove 20 miles to his small apartment, the terrifying silence of the night replaced only by the frantic beat of his own heart. He locked every window and door, dumped the radio in a spare room, and collapsed onto his couch. He tried to rationalize it, a highly elaborate, sick prank, a complex hoax. At 3:30 a.m., utterly exhausted, he reached for the phone to call the police, his hand trembling. The phone rang instantly. Ethan jumped back, staring at the handset. It was a landline. No one had this number except his mother. He slowly picked it up, his breath catching in his throat. There was no voice, no number station, no ghostly scraping. Just the clean, constant, and chilling electronic tone of a carrier signal. The distinct, high-pitched whistle that meant a coded message had just ended. And then a new sound began, overlaid on the tone. It was a quick, sharp, and very clear sound that only a shortwave operator would recognize. It was the sound of the radio's dial being twisted from inside his own apartment. A moment later, the dial twisting stopped, and the carrier tone was replaced by the familiar, cold German monotone. The voice was much louder now, close enough to be in the same room. 3, 5, 9, 8. Then the woman's voice broke, shifting from German to English, her tone low, flat, and final. "The key is in your left pocket." Ethan froze. His left hand instinctively went to his pants pocket. There, nestled among his car keys and lint, was the heavy, unfamiliar key that unlocked the basement of the St. Jude's Hospital Annex. He hadn't realized he had accidentally grabbed it from the janitor's ring when he fled. The radio box hadn't just been broadcasting his location. It had been directing the thing that was after him, and now it had possession of the radio. The last sound Ethan heard before the line went dead was the gentle, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a plastic radio knob being turned, broadcasting his location to the entity that had followed him home. Dr. Evelyn Reed had spent her career cataloging the forgotten, minor relics, archived documents, and especially the unheralded works of deceased, obscure artists. Her latest assignment took her to the remote manor house of the late Arthur Hemlock, a collector who had died alone, leaving behind an estate overflowing with his eccentric acquisitions. The manor was dark, smelling of dust and dried flowers. Evelyn, accompanied only by the estate lawyer, spent the first day clearing the entrance hall. Everything was draped in white sheets, lending the space a ghostly, expectant air. The only object left uncovered was a massive, life-sized portrait hanging above the marble fireplace. It depicted a man in his late 50s. Evelyn assumed it was Arthur Hemlock, dressed in severe Victorian black. The painting was masterfully executed, but unsettling. The subject's eyes, startlingly pale blue, were fixed in an expression that was less a stern gaze and more a look of profound, suffocating possession. "That's him," the lawyer muttered, fiddling nervously with his briefcase. He always insisted it was the only piece that truly captured his spirit. Evelyn found herself unable to stop looking at the eyes. They seemed to hold a light independent of the room's weak electric bulbs. "It's striking," she managed, finally forcing herself to look away. "I'll start inventory in the East Wing tomorrow." That night, Evelyn stayed in the manor's guest suite, a large, cold room on the second floor. She woke suddenly around 3 a.m., disturbed by an oppressive silence. The house was usually full of the old settling sounds, creaks and groans, but now there was nothing. She lay still, listening. Then, from the grand staircase, she heard it, a soft, rhythmic thump, drag, thump, drag. It sounded like something very heavy being moved one step at a time, or perhaps someone dragging a stiff, heavy burden up the stairs. Evelyn's breath hitched. She was utterly alone in the house. She scrambled out of bed and rushed to the door, locking it and sliding a heavy wooden chair under the handle. The thumping continued, growing steadily louder and closer, reaching the landing right outside her room. Thump, drag, thump, drag. The weight paused directly outside her door. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. Evelyn pressed her back against the wall, paralyzed by fear. A minute crawled by. 2. Then a sound, infinitely worse than the thumping, scraped through the keyhole, the sound of wood scratching glass. It was slow, grinding and deliberate, suggesting a fingertip tracing the pane of a keyhole lens. She knew the eyes of the portrait were on the other side of that door, seeing her. After what seemed like an eternity, the scratching stopped. The heavy, dragging sound resumed, receding down the hall, then slowly descending the staircase. Thump, drag, thump, drag, until the sound was swallowed by the silence of the ground floor. Evelyn stayed awake until dawn, rigid with terror. In the morning, she found no disturbance outside her room,
No marks on the door or the keyhole. It had to have been a nightmare, a terrifying trick of the old house. She went downstairs to the entrance hall. The light was better now, washing the marble and the portrait in a cold gray illumination. Evelyn approached the fireplace. The portrait was exactly as she remembered, the subject's pale blue eyes fixed in that profoundly possessive gaze. But something was wrong. Subtly, sickeningly wrong. The portrait of Arthur Hemlock was no longer dressed in severe Victorian black. The canvas now depicted him wearing a dusty, heavy wool coat. Evelyn's coat. She spun around, frantic. Her coat was gone from the hook where she had left it by the front door. A faint, sickly sweet scent permeated the air, a mixture of oil paint and dried flowers. She slowly turned back to the portrait, her eyes traveling from the familiar wool coat up to the figure's face.
The man in the portrait was staring at her. But the portrait was no longer of Arthur Hemlock. The figure in the painting now had a smooth, perfectly oval face framed by dark brown hair. The lips were painted a shocked, pale pink, and the large, terrified eyes were the exact color of her own deep green eyes. The man she thought was Arthur Hemlock had been painted over, or perhaps simply replaced by a perfect life-size image of Evelyn herself, dressed in her coat, eternally suspended on the canvas. As she stared into the painted likeness of her own horrified face, Evelyn noticed the final, appalling detail. The pale blue eyes of the original collector, Arthur Hemlock, had not vanished. They had simply been painted into her eyes. They were visible now, not as irises, but as two tiny, malevolent pinpricks of blue light reflecting in the center of the painted green irises, staring back at her from the inside of her own artistic prison. And as she watched, the painted lips of her likeness stretched into a faint, satisfied, knowing smile, but the voice that whispered from the canvas was high, thin, and ancient. "You're not forgotten now, little curator." In the corner of the portrait, near the floor, a new date had been freshly painted. November 13, 2013.
The year was 1988, and for Liam, the late shift at the local radio station, KLDY, was less a job and more a silent endurance test. Tonight, it was just him, the humming static of the transmitters, and the faint, pervasive smell of old coffee and dust. The station was housed in a brick building on the edge of town, surrounded by fields of dead corn stalks that looked like skeletal fingers scratching the night sky. Around 2 a.m., deep into his shift, the request line phone, a heavy beige relic of the 70s, rang. Liam sighed, already expecting some drunken teenager asking for another Bon Jovi song. He picked up. "KLDY, you're on the air. What can I play for you?" Silence. Not dead air, but a clean, smooth, unbroken silence. "Hello? Listener?" He tried again, adjusting the volume dial on his console. Click. The line went dead. Liam frowned and hung up. Probably a misdial. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number, same line. Liam answered quickly. "KLDY, can I help you?" Again, the silence. This time it lasted a full 5 seconds. Liam was about to hang up when a sound, tiny and muffled, drifted across the line. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of a very slow, shallow breath. "Listen, if this is a prank, I'm going to have to disconnect you," Liam warned, his voice louder than necessary. The breathing stopped. Then, so faint he almost missed it, he heard a sound that chilled him instantly. The quiet, deliberate sound of someone swallowing. Click. The line cut out. Liam stared at the phone. He felt a cold prickle of unease. The sound wasn't playful or malicious. It was too private, too focused. It sounded like someone concentrating very hard on not making a sound. He tried to shake it off and focused on queuing up the next block of songs. The phone rang a third time. Liam snatched it up, annoyance mixing with a growing dread. "Look, stop calling this number!" This time, there was no silence. There was a sound that Liam's stomach dropped out. The exact sound of the studio door being quietly, slowly unlocked and opened. Liam spun around in his chair. The heavy, insulated steel door, clearly visible through the glass wall of the sound booth, was still firmly shut, the lock indicator green. He slammed the phone down, his heart hammering against his ribs. It must have been a trick of the old telephone line, crosstalk, or a loose wire. He got up and nervously checked the main studio door, pulling on the handle to confirm the lock was set. It was secure. He turned back to his console, trying to steady his hands. The phone rang a fourth time. He watched it ring, his chest tightening painfully. He knew he shouldn't answer, but the relentless, mechanical "bring, bring" was grating on his sanity. He picked it up, but didn't speak. On the other end, there was no breathing, no swallowing, no sound of the door. Instead, there was a steady, rhythmic, utterly neutral dial tone. Liam held the receiver away from his ear, staring at the humming console lights. Why would a caller connect and just hold a dial tone? He brought the receiver back up. The tone was still there, clean, constant, electronic. Then, the tone changed. It was still a dial tone, but it was overlaid with something else, a faint, mechanical whine that started low and gradually, agonizingly grew in pitch. It wasn't loud, but it burrowed into Liam's skull. It sounded exactly like the main audio tape reel of the station's massive, ancient tape machine, the one kept in the locked, unmanned utility closet just across the hall, winding in reverse. Liam's blood went cold. That machine was never used at night. It wasn't even connected to the request line. He stood up, his gaze locked on the phone, the piercing, reversing whine growing louder through the receiver. "Who is this?" he whispered, his voice thin with terror. The whining stopped instantly. The clean dial tone returned. Then, the dial tone broke, replaced by a single, distorted, but perfectly recognizable soundbite. A snippet of Liam's own voice from the opening of his show an hour ago. "You're on the air. What can I play for you?" The voice was warped, elongated, and played back slowly like an exhausted recording. Liam dropped the phone. The receiver clattered on the floor, emitting a sound like a wet, slapping hand. He scrambled backward until his spine hit the mixing board, his eyes glued to the dark glass of the booth window. He had never told anyone where he parked his car. He never left the keys out. He heard the receiver on the floor emit one last sound before the line finally went dead. It was the unmistakable, metallic jangle of his car keys.
Liam didn't move for the rest of the night. He sat frozen, watching the empty studio. When the morning engineer, Frank, arrived at 6 a.m., he found Liam slumped in the chair, shivering violently, utterly silent.
Frank eventually got Liam home. Later that day, the police investigated the station. The studio door was still locked, the windows sealed. Nothing was missing, except for two things. The tape from the large reel-to-reel machine in the utility closet was found completely unspooled and crumpled on the floor. Liam's car was gone from the parking lot. Liam was interviewed repeatedly, but he could only repeat the same facts. The dial tone, the reversing tape, the sound of the keys. The police chalked it up to a psychotic break and a theft. A week later, still unable to sleep, Liam moved in with his brother across town. On his first morning there, he went to the kitchen for coffee. The kitchen had a wall-mounted phone, a clean, modern white model. As he reached for the coffee maker, the white phone rang. Liam froze. He looked at the caller ID box Frank had installed. It read, "Unknown." He let it ring, once, twice. On the third ring, he couldn't take it anymore. He picked it up, his hand shaking. He didn't speak. He just listened. And there it was. Not the breathing, not the whining tape, just the clean, constant, maddening dial tone. The call lasted only 3 seconds. Then the dial tone broke, and Liam heard a sound that confirmed the horrifying truth of the encounter. The sound was clear, close, and deliberate. The distinctive, sharp crunch of his old wool coat, the one he had worn that night, being run over by a car tire. And then nothing. Not a dial tone, not a click, just dead air. The line hadn't hung up. The thing on the other end simply had nothing more to say. It had followed him across town, and now it was simply waiting for him to try and call the police. It had him on a literal, invisible line, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that the next time it rang, it wouldn't be his coat it was crushing.
The late autumn air hung heavy and damp over the outskirts of Blackwood Creek, chilling Oliva to the bone even through her thick wool coat. She hadn't wanted to take the shortcut, but dusk was settling fast, and a longer paved route would mean walking alone in the dark for over an hour. This narrow, unpaved logging road, mostly forgotten and skirted by dense, reedy marshland, would cut her commute home in half. Her footsteps crunched rhythmically on the gravel, a lonely sound swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive silence. She tried to focus on the faint glow of the distant town lights, but her gaze kept drifting to the marsh. The reeds, brittle and brown in the failing light, stood taller than a person, creating a whispering, impenetrable wall on either side of the track. Rustle. Oliva froze. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was sharper, closer. "Just an animal," she muttered, gripping the strap of her bag tighter. She quickened her pace, trying to convince herself it was a rabbit or perhaps a deer preparing to bed down. Another rustle. This time it was unmistakably behind her, not from the surrounding marsh, but right on the road where her footsteps had just been. She risked a quick glance over her shoulder. Nothing. The road stretched empty behind her, disappearing into the deepening twilight. The unsettling thought that she had only heard the sound after she stopped walking sent a cold tremor down her spine. She started walking again, faster now, a low, panicked hum rising in her ears. She refused to run. Running would confirm her fear and perhaps draw something out. Then she saw it. About 50 yards ahead, where the reeds grew thickest and leaned across the road, she saw a flicker of movement. Not the waving of the reeds in the breeze, but something behind them, a definite shift in the brown, tangled mass. She froze. Her breath hitched. The movement ceased instantly. Oliva squinted, her eyes straining in the gloom.
The shape of the reeds was unbroken, yet she felt an absolute certainty that something was observing her from that spot. It was like feeling the weight of a gaze, silent and utterly hostile, pressed against her. She took a slow, deliberate step back. As if triggered by her movement, a single heavy reed stalk in the center of the disturbed area bent slowly, unnaturally, away from the track, creating a tiny, jagged peephole. Through the gap, Oliva saw nothing but deep shadow. But that shadow was focused. It was an absence of light that seemed to absorb the weak moonlight. A primal survival instinct took over. Oliva dropped her bag and ran, her fear finally overcoming her desire to appear calm. Her footsteps hammered the gravel, propelling her toward the distant bend in the road, the only thing that felt like an escape. She didn't dare look back, but the silence she ran into was worse than any noise. The rustling had stopped. The presence wasn't following with sound. It was keeping pace, silently, a profound, terrifying awareness riding on her every terrified stride. Finally, she rounded the bend, the lights of a lone farmstead visible ahead. She threw herself into the high, thorny hedge bordering the field, scrambling blindly through to the grass, desperate to leave the track. Safe within the boundary of the farm, she collapsed, sobbing, clutching her knees. She stayed there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the scream, the touch, the sound of pursuit. But there was nothing. Only the distant, comforting sounds of the farm and the crickets. Eventually, trembling but rational, she forced herself up. It had been an animal, she told herself, a trick of the light, a moment of panic. She hadn't seen a face, she hadn't heard a footstep. She carefully made her way back to the road, her heart still pounding a frantic rhythm. Her bag lay exactly where she had dropped it. She walked the last half-mile home without incident, let herself into her small, empty cottage, and locked the door with 3 separate bolts.
That night, Oliva couldn't sleep. She sat bolt upright in bed, a glass of water cold in her hand, watching the single sheer window of her bedroom. She kept telling herself she was safe. The town was nearby. She was home. It was just before 3 a.m. when she heard a faint, scraping sound from the wall adjacent to her bed. It was rhythmic, soft, like something extremely coarse being dragged very slowly across the exterior stucco. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. She covered her ears, her eyes wide with terror, but the sound seemed to penetrate her hands, vibrating through the silence of her room. She knew, with the sickening certainty of a true victim, that this was the sound of its movement. It hadn't stayed in the marsh. It had followed her scent, her memory, her fear, all the way home. She pressed her face into her pillow and waited for the dawn. When the sun finally rose, turning the sky a pale, hopeful blue, the sound stopped. Oliva didn't move for another hour. Finally, driven by a morbid, irresistible need, she crept out of bed and approached the window. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she pulled the curtain back just a fraction. In the center of her small, perfectly manicured lawn, the grass had been flattened, disturbed in a large, messy circle. But it was the window itself that made her mouth go dry and her vision tunnel. Pressed against the lower corner of the glass, high enough that a person would have had to stretch or stand on something to reach it, was a single perfect handprint. It wasn't a human hand.
The print was long and impossibly thin, the fingers ending in sharp, needle-like points that had gouged 4 distinct parallel marks into the dust on the outside of the glass. The palm was too large, and the thumb had 4 segments. But the most terrifying detail was the substance it was made of. It wasn't mud, dirt, or dust. It was a delicate, dense collection of dry brown marsh reeds, woven so tightly together by some sticky, clear exudate that they formed the exact, horrifying shape of the watching creature's hand. The thing had not only stood outside her window and watched, but it had pressed a literal piece of its habitat, a calling card of where she had been seen, against her home. It knew where she lived now. Just as the realization settled into the cold, crushing weight of reality, Oliva noticed one more thing. Beneath the window, driven deep into the soil and standing straight up like a gruesome flag, was her wool coat, neatly impaled by a single, bloodless, perfectly stripped bone.
Exodo. Exodo. Exodo story.